Masks. Why do we wear them? What do they mean? So much to explore, this tension between the true self and the symbolic self, this shield of physical identity that may also obscure what is experienced through it. Is anonymity worth the price of dissociation? Can any two faces truly wear the same mask? What if two dudes wore really similar bug masks and then went on to become one, sharing a physical body and a new identity under a confusing and overlong naming convention? Some, if not all of these questions, will be answered here and now. So grab your helmets, rev your bikes, and put on your most stylish scarf. Because today I want to talk about Shin Kamen Rider, aka The Devil Wears Prana, aka Neon Genesis Augmentalion. This movie's absolutely wild.
Allow me to be forthcoming. I know precious little about the genre of tokusatsu. I like Godzilla, I watched Power Rangers as a kid, but that's basically the extent of my knowledge. However, this is YouTube, and lacking prerequisite experience has never stopped anyone from saying anything, least of all me. Shin Kamen Rider is the third in Neon Genesis Evangelion creator Hideaki Anno's series of reboot/reimagining films of iconic tokusatsu properties, following Shin Godzilla and Shin Ultraman. It's the only one he made entirely without collaborator Shinji Higuchi, and so by extension, probably the most unabashedly Anno. If you don't already know of this man, here's the cliff notes. Existentialism, wide shots, and emotionally distant women with bobs. And rest assured, fans of his work, he did not skimp on the bob. I came across this after watching Shin Godzilla, which I enjoyed. I imagine this makes me the ideal target market for a gritty reboot of Kamen Rider. Someone who could be convinced to like it. Someone with just enough nerd knowledge to recognize Anno, trust in him, and hopefully appreciate a modernized version of a Japanese icon, but give it the slack necessary to keep true to its roots. Maybe I'm misreading, maybe I'm projecting, maybe the world, and by extension the Japanese film industry, does not in fact revolve around me. But for a glorious 17 and a half minutes, I really felt like it did. To say that Shin Kamen Rider starts on the right foot is an understatement. Shin Kamen Rider starts by pushing off the right foot into a 100-foot jump, doing 14 front flips, and then using that same right foot to drive through the ground like a nuclear lawn dart into the center of the earth. I audibly guffawed when this motherfucker Hongo came out the gates just straight up crushing skulls. I don't know if Kamen Rider usually does that, but I do know the Red Ranger never did. So the movie opens with our sweet boy Takeshi Hongo, victim of a traumatic backstory and subject of generic super science TM, rescuing a nice young lady with, you guessed it kids, a bob, from a spider-themed supervillain who works for the organization. As previously mentioned, Hongo, referred to by his counterpart as Grasshopper, kills the absolute fuck out of all the goons and escapes with the girl. This newfound strength distresses him, and you can tell, because let's actually do an early tangent. So first things first, everyone in this movie is serving up a whole honey glazed ham. I get it, it's part of the fun, I'm super into it, honestly. But the guy who plays Hongo does this thing whenever he's supposed to be really distressed or emotional. He just vibrates like a Furby, and I think it's the funniest thing in the world. Anyway, what follows is a classic exposition dump. Anno's cooking up some aggressively Anno shots, Sustainable Happiness Organization was the name of my band in college, boom, Spider-Man shows up again and kills the good doctor, and kidnaps Rico again. And so Hongo, the half-man, half-grasshopper, rocking his fresh new scarf, becomes Kamen Rider, and he says, oh boy, here I go killing again, and then he kills everybody, and the pair set off in their super cool motorcycle. The opening sequence absolutely rips, and it's credit to Anno's ability to blend his insane brand of expressionism with classic B-movie-esque aesthetics. The music is weird and grungy, the costumes are stark and colorful, but just sleek enough to function in a modern setting. The action is choppy and cartoonish, full of jump cuts and weird angles and whiplash, but it's never technically bad directing. It's a style charmingly and very purposely reminiscent of old tokusatsu. If you've ever seen a single episode of Power Rangers, you will recognize a lot of the camera work and choreography. Probably much more so if you actually know Kamen Rider. What it's not is weightless in the way its predecessors so often were. It's less camp and more gonzo, dripping with style and a surprising amount of swagger for what is ultimately 2 hours of freak shows and bug suits beating the shit out of each other and shouting about happiness. It's towing a difficult line, promising you that this is still the fun, goofy thing you probably know and love. It's just that all the dials have been turned up to 11. The thing about 11 is not every dial does the same thing. Style at 11 is a great thing. Pacing at 11 is kind of a mixed bag. Theme at 11 doesn't really exist, so what you usually get is a sort of noisy feedback. Shin Kamen Rider isn't just noise, but tight execution is, for better or worse, just not in Anno's vocabulary. I'd like to very briefly switch movies. 2016's Shin Godzilla is a strange take on Godzilla, but has a very clear goal in mind. It's as subtle as a sledgehammer, a film born entirely of frustration with Japan's inefficient culture of bureaucracy, especially regarding governmental response to recent crises like the 2011 Fukushima disaster. For all of its flaws, its unnecessarily large cast, jargoning dialogue scenes, Godzilla's googly eyes, Shin Godzilla is a compact, controlled story that delivers its message and honors the legacy of its iconic namesake by making him appropriately gross and terrifying. I'm not saying this is entirely due to Higuchi's involvement, but, well, what I can say about Shin Kamen Rider is that it never stops being fun and weird, and that alone makes it worth the watch. It does, however, stop being tight, which is a little bit disappointing. To play devil's advocate, it sure does seem like the legacy of Kamen Rider is more dense, I guess, than just being a huge radioactive lizard that loves swimming and hates buildings. Let's keep going. Shortly after the opening sequence, our heroes are approached by a pair of government suits who say, "Hey, great job killing that Shocker guy. We should team up to kill the rest of the Shocker augments before they destroy humanity." Naturally, our heroes agree, and so begins what is, by all accounts, a wildly overstuffed boss rush. The action and set pieces are, I cannot stress enough, consistently creative and charming, if not downright awesome. But this is where the flaws inherent to cramming what is a clearly more complex world than that of Godzilla into an equally single film length start to show. There are, if you count Grasshopper 2, which we'll get to, a whopping 7 augmented Shocker bosses that have to be introduced, confronted, and defeated within the bounds of a 2-hour, 3-act structure, and that's just the main plot. For reference, Scott Pilgrim vs. the World, a film which also has 7 antagonists, hinges its already shaved-down romantic B-plot on just pinballing through the boss rush to save time. The Katayanagis don't even get lines. This is not to say Shin Kamen Rider fails to maintain your attention as it hums along its hit list. In fact, Anno's eye for insane visuals actually serve as great punctuation for each Shocker boss. Their layers and costumes are always absurdly well designed, each sort of existential vignette, at least in isolation, providing either some brilliant shots, outside the box set pieces, or playfully compelling melodrama. What the weight presses on is the connective tissue between sequences. It's a bananas tokusatsu story, I get it, and one made as a gritty reboot potentially aimed just at mostly long-time fans of the series who've grown up with it, but I mean, fuck if I literally couldn't follow it half the time. Things I haven't even touched on yet include Ruriko being an android, but having a real brother who is the Doctor's real son, who is the main antagonist and is a metaphorical but also literal butterfly augment in some kind of data chrysalis. Shocker itself being separately run by an AI called K, who just walks around in a suit and kind of comments on things. The butterfly guy's evil plan being just the primordial soup from Evangelion. It's almost the exact same thing. I don't know if Anno lifted it from old Kamen Rider when he was writing Eva, or if it's not from the old shows and this is just his favorite trope. I don't hate it, I just think it's weird. What you really want when you're being jargoned and anime expositioned to death is an anchor, something that casual viewers can grab onto the first time they watch and say, cool, most of this is just fun and wacky, but I'm gonna give a shit about this thing. A solid example is The Matrix. Most of what they actually say is nonsense. The pillars of its world building are more functionally absurd than even science fiction should allow. But Neo is easy to understand, and his relationship with Trinity carries him through his arc. The anchor you get in Shin Kamen Rider is Hongo's relationship with Ruriko, which for the most part works pretty well. They have enough chemistry to justify a questionably platonic will they won't they dynamic, and their shared daddy issues do enough heavy lifting to kind of iron over their various complicated relationships that really should have gotten more attention than like the crazy bat guy. Look, it's not Shakespeare, but if that's what you came here for, you're an idiot. Tokusatsu literally means special photography, which is industry code for goofy genre bullshit. But let me let you in on a little secret, and this is where the seams start to snap. We're not at the goofy part yet. About halfway through the movie, Butterfly Man, whose real name is Ichiro, sheds his chrysalis and is confronted by Ruriko and Hongo. So he calls out a second grasshopper augment, a journalist named Hayato Ichimonji, to come kick the shit out of Hongo, which he does because he is vastly superior. He breaks Hongo's legs, but is snapped out of his hypnosis at the last second by Ruriko, who is then immediately assassinated by a different shocker agent. It's actually a really strong scene for both Ruriko and Hongo, giving Ruriko an emotional end to her arc and teaching Hongo the value of compassion, allowing him to understand and accept the circumstances of his father's murder. But it does leave us with a new co-protagonist, 85 minutes into a 2-hour movie. And boy howdy does Anno not care why he suddenly decides to help 5 minutes later after saying he wouldn't. I imagine Ichimonji is an important character in the Kamen Rider canon, that this decision is like having a Green Lantern movie with both Hal Jordan and Jon Stewart in it. But at this point, with such a breakneck pace, the question that looms in the air is, did it really all need to be in here? That's the main issue holding this story back. One cook, too many dishes. I have no doubt Anno was a huge fan of Kamen Rider, and I can only hope he did it justice in the eyes of its other fans. But the word Shin was chosen for these reboots because of its ambiguity, potentially meaning both new and true. When you throw everything into the primordial soup, the habitat realm, it becomes significantly less of either. The pair of Kamen Rider's final showdown with Ichiro, now Kamen Rider Zero, is about what you'd expect after seeing most of this movie. It's a mixed bag, a competently campy and melodramatic tokusatsu fight speckled with some impressive new ideas and some baffling, unsightly ones. In the end, Ichiro and Hongo both die, and Ichimonji becomes the new Kamen Rider, dubbed Kamen Rider 2+1 because Hongo's soul is in the helmet. A fitting metaphor for a movie so existential in theory and yet so comically overstuffed in practice. So what does it all amount to? I said it several times already. It's fun. Whether that's enough depends entirely on your expectations. From an outsider's perspective, it's obviously hard to appreciate Anno's love for this series, but it's not that hard to appreciate his decision to goof off where he saw fit. That sort of clunky charm is, to my understanding, what made tokusatsu popular in the first place. Shin Kamen Rider never entirely comes together, but admittedly that may be more of an Anno thing than a Kamen Rider thing. He's a moments guy, not really a connective tissue guy. Sometimes that's okay. In the case of Shin Kamen Rider, I think that's okay.
I realize now that I never said anything particularly profound about masks, and so instead, here's some Lucha history for you. In the early 2010s, Lucha superstar Místico was hired by the WWE and rebranded as Sin Cara. But despite his lack of English proficiency, he was pushed to the main roster too quickly, and he flopped, eventually getting himself suspended for breaking the wellness policy. He was briefly replaced during this time with a different Sin Cara, who was previously a different Místico in a different Lucha promotion. When the original Sin Cara returned from suspension, the two feuded, culminating in a mask versus mask match for the right to be Sin Cara, which, when you think about it, is a little bit like Shin Kamen Rider.